Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Welcome back. Last year I wrote a post, didn't end up in an audio blog, I don't think, about what it took to be a working group chair. If you'd like a link to that, it's in the corresponding post for this particular one. And I realized I didn't write one about what it takes to be a contributor. So if you've not spent a lot of time around standards work, it's pretty easy to assume that it's the working group chairs that are the people who write or are responsible for standards because they're visible, right? They run meetings. Their names are often in the charter. They're on slides. They're often the ones explaining outcomes to the outside world. But standards don't generally get written by the chairs. The chairs are the conveners, the facilitators, the stewards of process, right? They organize discussions, they manage scope, and they make sure that the group follows the rules it's agreed to operate under, right? So they create the conditions for work to happen. The actual work, the ideas, the arguments, the draft text, the trade-offs, those come from the contributors. And if a working group doesn't have any contributors, you don't get a specification. All you really have is a calendar invitation. So today I want to talk about contributor skills, not in so much an abstract aspirational sense, but in a very practical sense as to what actually helps standards move from an interesting idea to text that someone can implement. Now, it starts with understanding that contributor is not a single role. It's a collection of ways that showing up happen, and the most effective contributors tend to move between those different roles over time. So let's start there. There is not just one way to contribute. Most contributors fall into a few broad patterns. None of them are more important than the other. Some people show up primarily as subject matter experts, right? They bring deep knowledge about a particular domain, such as cryptography or browsers or enterprise deployments, regulation, privacy, payments, whatever is relevant to the problem at hand. And their value isn't just that they know things, right? It's that they know where systems break. They can spot edge cases pretty early. They can explain why a seemingly simple design choice creates downstream risk, or why a proposal that looks elegant on paper is going to be excruciatingly painful to implement in practice. Now, that said, that's obviously a pretty important role, but other contributors mainly participate as implementers, right? They read specifications where they very particular eye. They are asking whether the text is ambiguous, whether requirements conflict, whether assumptions line up with how systems are actually built and operated. The implementers are often the first to say, I don't know how I would ship this, or this requirement sounds reasonable, but it doesn't actually work in production. And that feedback is completely invaluable. The specs that ignore implementer input tend to look fine right up until no one implements them. And then there's reviewers. They are also contributors. They're very important contributors. Reviewers don't always propose new mechanisms or architectures. Instead, they're reading the draft carefully and asking yet another set of questions. Is this understandable? Is the terminology used consistently? Could someone reasonably implement this without having sat through 2 years of meetings? Good reviewers save working groups from themselves. They catch problems that no one else notices because everyone else is too close to the work. Most effective contributors don't stay in any one of these roles. They shift depending on the topic, the phase of work, and what the group needs at the moment. Now, regardless of which role you're playing, one principle matters more than almost anything else, and that's keeping whatever feedback or whatever you're contributing focused on the technical problem and not the people in the room. I mean, that sounds pretty obvious, but in practice, it's actually one of the hardest skills to learn. Standards discussions get really long. People get invested. Decisions feel very high stakes, especially when they affect deployed systems, regulatory expectations, or years of prior work. But productive contributors keep their critiques aimed at the ideas, the assumptions, and the consequences, not the authors, the intent, or the competence involved. Disagreement is not a failure in standards work. It's actually very, very essential to standards work. But disagreement only helps when it stays focused on the technical problem at hand, right? There's a big difference between saying this design doesn't work and explaining this design doesn't work Here's why I don't think it works. Here's what breaks, or here's what trade-offs it's making. That's the first thing, just the this doesn't work, full stop, ends the conversation. It's not helpful. The second gives the group something to engage with. And you can think of it as clarity being a form of respect. Respectful engagement means you're being clear as to what you disagree or don't disagree with, which leads directly to another core contributor skill, bringing solutions and not just objections. Pointing out problems is absolutely necessary, but stopping there isn't enough. The contributors who consistently help groups move forward do more than say no. They explain the problem, they describe the constraint, and when possible, offer an alternative. Granted, that won't always be possible because if they knew the answer to the question, why would they be there anyway? It would have been done already. But that said, that alternative might be revised text. It might be a different architectural approach. It might simply be a clearer framing of the decision the group is actually making. The proposal does not have to be perfect. Doesn't actually even have to be right. What matters is that it's concrete, something that the group can react to, refine, or reject. And the progress is coming from having something in front of them to dig into. Preparation is actually another skill that doesn't get nearly enough credit. Standards work is cumulative. Decisions build on earlier discussions, on issues that were closed, on prior drafts. When contributors show up without awareness of that history, the group ends up rehashing the same debates over and over again, which doesn't tend to make anybody very happy. If you're new to a group, one of the most valuable things you can do is read before you speak. Skim the past meeting notes, look at open and closed issues, get a sense of which questions are still live and which ones the group have already settled. Doesn't mean you can't challenge past decisions. You can, and sometimes you should. But the most effective way to do that is to acknowledge the earlier discussion and explain what has changed. Right? If you're bringing new information, that's one thing. If you just disagree, well, if they've already talked about it, it doesn't matter that you disagree. It's been decided. So what has changed could be new deployment experience, new regulatory pressure, or new technical constraints. All of those can justify revisiting a decision. But simply restating an old argument usually doesn't do anything but annoy people and waste time. Now, if you've been around longer, the expectation on you is higher. Institutional memory is part of your contribution. Knowing why the group landed where it did helps prevent cycles of frustration and drift. Now, at some point, every contributor has to grapple with consensus. Consensus, let me remind you, does not mean that everybody agrees. It means that the group can live with the decision and move on. Good contributors engage during the decision-making phase. They make their objections clear, specific, and on record. And once consensus is called, they accept the outcome, even if it wasn't the one they wanted. Bad contributors, no biscuit, keep reopening the same debate, hoping that persistence will eventually wear the group down. And that behavior does not actually strengthen the work. It just erodes the trust and can, in some cases, lead to work being abandoned because nobody likes conflict and they will just stop engaging. So accepting consensus, it's not about suppressing dissent, but it is about respecting the collective process you chose to participate in. And speaking of process, right, process awareness plays a pretty big role here, and possibly a bigger role than many people may realize. You don't need to be a process expert to contribute, but you do need to understand at least the basics of the standards body you're working in. Do they have specific rules about consensus? Or perhaps they don't do consensus, they do voting. What intellectual property rules apply? That's actually pretty important for you to know. What code of conduct is expected from participants? That's pretty important too. Most process problems in standards work aren't malicious. They're misunderstandings where someone didn't actually understand what the process was sufficiently, that they just went off a deep end, and that's where the chairs will have to come in and straighten things out. Knowing the rules will keep disagreements technical instead of procedural, and it will keep procedural fights from derailing real work. Now, one of the hardest truths about standards work is that reliability matters more than brilliance, right? The contributors who shake standards over time aren't always the ones with the flashiest ideas or the strongest opinions. They're the ones who show up consistently, that follow through on their actions, that review drafts when asked, and stay engaged even when the work becomes slow or tedious. Standards work is not, has not been, will not ever be a sprint. It's actually not even a marathon. It's more like a relay with no clear finish. And reliability builds that trust that you need in order to keep running that relay race. Once you have trust, trust gives your technical input weight as you are participating in the process. Now, none of these skills, I would say, are innate to a person. They're being a good contributor is something you learn how to do. You learn it by watching how group operates, by participating, by getting things wrong, and by adjusting. The barrier to entry is a lot lower than many people think. You don't need to be the smartest person in the room. I have yet to be the smartest person in a room. You don't need to have all of the answers. I very rarely have any of the answers. It's very frustrating. But you know what? You do need to be willing to engage thoughtfully, to do the homework, and focus on helping the group resolve the problems in front of it. Now, if you do want to influence how technology actually evolves, not just how it's marketed, being a strong contributor is one of the most effective ways to do it. And unlike being a chair, it doesn't actually require a nomination or an election. It just requires willingness to do the work. And I hope with that more of you will think about that and think about how you can be a contributor, because goodness knows we could always use more perspective in standards development. Thanks for your time, and tune in again next week. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.